Okay, and so to round out our special weapon tier lists, we're going to end on Glaives, everyone's favorite son for endgame PvE. Let's talk about briefly the Glaive weapon function in endgame PvE. First, out of two roles, I would say number one, glaives are for blocking extremely high amounts of damage in low power content. Glaives have absolutely ridiculous DR. So even in a Grandmaster, if a barrier champion's about to stomp you, if a boss about to stomp you, nothing will save you but a glaive with a glaive shield blocking for you. So that is number one. And number two, we also have melee spam builds with exotics like Wormgod Caress, Syntheseps, Winter's Guile, and using abilities like Devour and Banner of War, that sort of thing. Now, these are not as popular. They're definitely very situational, very niche. But, you know, in case something like the Syntheseps rework next season changes some things about that, something to keep an eye on, certainly. And, you know, I've always wanted to try using, you know, a Glaive, Banner of War, and some sort of melee exotic in a GM. So, you know, maybe I'll give that a try. But certainly very niche and certainly not a mainstream damage strategy or anything like that in most endgame PvE loadouts. So let's, you know, mostly stick to the blocking context for now. Another thing you should be aware of when we come to talking about glaives in endgame PvE is that unlike something like a shotgun or a trace rifle or a GL, which is basically going to be universally good in endgame content, glaives are, number one, very situational in their use, and number two, I would even call them artifact dependent. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in most low power content, part of the challenge is that there's champions, and glaives are one of the best unstop options. But what happens when you have a seasonal artifact like this season's where you don't have unstop glaive? Well, I mean, you could choose to bring a glaive into a GM. I mean, the blocking is certainly useful, but is it so useful that you would give up something like Forbearance or a Cenotaph Trace when you could be using a different stun option instead? Like, you know, not really. So in the content where glaives actually that damage resistance starts to matter, again, whether or not a glaive is slot efficient kind of depends on the artifact. And so glaives are very much a situational weapon right now until they get a rework or until they get some sort of change that will make them more viable or make that DR even more useful than it currently is. You know, as cool as it is, as cool as the niche perk, as cool as the niche role that glaives currently play in the sandbox. Okay, so with that being said, let's go over the glaive factors. Okay, so what did I actually consider when we're talking about glaive ranking? I had to do some research about this myself. I'm not a glaive aficionado like a lot of you are, but I did a lot of research. With the help of my chat, we came up with a small list of factors to talk about when it comes to glaives. So first, we have archetype, and second, we have perks. So when it comes to archetype, glaives have three archetypes. There's rapid and aggressive, which there's only one of each of those when it comes to glaives. So that's going to be Greasy Luck from Ghost of the Deep. This is the only rapid glaive in the game. And then Kelgorath, Judgment of Kelgorath, which is the only aggressive in the game. Everything else is an adaptive frame. So how do we score frames? Well, here's, you know, how we score them very simply. Number one, adaptives got 2 points, rapids got 1 point, and aggressives got 0 points. So you might be saying, you know, why are we so harsh on aggressives? Surely that doesn't make that much of a difference when it comes to glaives. And while you might be right, a lot of these glaives, I think most of these glaives will basically just do the job of the top tier glaives without much of a difference, because glaives are not like GLs where the frame is like a huge difference, or from the best glaive to the worst glaive, there's like a huge difference. Most glaives will do the job of blocking kind of just normally, even if you didn't have any perks. But that being said, aggressive frames currently have the lowest overall stat package, right? I mean, like reload speed awful, handling awful, and shield duration reduced. And there's no upside, right? They don't do more melee damage, and they do more, you know, per hit damage, but that's not really that important when it comes to glaives. You're not using a glaive for projectile damage, right? It's one of the lowest DPS special weapon types in the game. So again, aggressives, pretty much all downsides and no upsides. Rapids are kind of similar. They have the best stat packages when it comes to handling and reload, but their shield duration is very reduced. So rapids, you know, they have good handling, they have good reload again, but that, you know, that lower shield duration, even if rapids do fire faster so you can get more glaive energy more quickly, that shield duration does actually become quite noticeable when you're comparing it to something like a 50 shield duration stat on an adaptive. And of course, adaptives have similar handling and reload as well, so that's why we gave them the most points. That's why we gave aggressives the least points, and rapids are right in the middle. Okay, perks are the only other thing when it comes to glaives, because, you know, affinity is not really a major thing when it comes to glaives. You don't really care about surges because your projectile damage is not something you're looking to boost that much on glaives. And also, I didn't really account for competition as well, because I felt like that would be too much of a I don't know, like a polarizing factor when it comes to glaives because they mostly do the same thing, right? So it would just be kind of repeating the results that already exist and exacerbating the differences. So let's talk about perks. Perks, I split them into 4 categories. We have ammo, reload, utility, and damage. So for ammo, it's pretty much just lead from gold on glaives. And I only gave it half a point because realistically, glaives, they don't really suffer from ammo economy that much. A lot of the time, if you're using the glaive rapidly for something like ad clear or for, you know, just hacking away at stuff, you're using the melee, which doesn't cost any ammo, right? And then in terms of glaive energy, they're very efficient when in terms of like, you know, conserving their energy and just using it to block whenever you need it. You certainly have enough ammo, so lead from gold doesn't become a huge deal, especially with how glaives have a generally slow reload animation. You're much more likely to want a reload perk instead of lead from gold in the first column, so I only gave lead from gold half a point. Next up, we have reload perks. Reload perks, it's stuff like auto-loading holster, impulse amplifier, grave robber, replenishing. I chose to give grave, auto-loading, and replenishing 2 points, and then I gave impulse 1 point. Impulse is a projectile velocity increase, which is marginally useful, and then a reload, you know, flat reload bump, which is fine, but there's other perks on glaives that are just either better in terms of, you know, being QOL perks like autoloading, or they kind of make more sense in the context of a glaive, like grave robber or replenishing ages. So that's why I chose to give impulse only 1, with everything else getting 2. Next up, we have utility perks. Utility perks, I'm talking about stuff like immovable object, unrelenting, demo, and pugilist. So I chose to give immovable object 2 points because it grants a huge amount of increased weapon energy, so shield energy, when you hit something while you're still with your glaive out, and you're blocking and you're shooting something. It gives you almost twice the energy per hit, which is, you know, really, really great. It's very, very efficient. If you're in something like a GM and you're blocking, you're shielding a res, or you're just blocking in general and you're shooting an ad, you're gonna get twice energy back. That's very, very efficient. That's like, you know, it increases your ammo to shield energy conversion rate by like 2 times, which is, you know, really, really great. So I gave immovable 2 points. Unrelenting, I gave 1 point. Demo and pugilist, I also gave 1 point. So those are kind of just utility perks, take it or leave it, pretty situational. Finally, for damage perks, we have frenzy, unstop force, and close to melee. Yeah, those are pretty much the only 3 perks that kind of matter. Frenzy, it's because it's basically 100 handling and 100 reload boost, which is awesome for glaives. It makes them feel very, very snappy, very, very effective. So I gave that 2 points on top of the projectile damage increase. Unstoppable force is also kind of useful. It's a little bit situational. You need to be blocking and receiving damage, but it's still pretty good. So, you know, again, situational, but I gave it 1 point. And finally, close to melee, I decided to give 3 points because if you're using a glaive for damage purposes specifically, this is by far the best damage perk. It's a 30% boost to melee damage, and it's the only glaive damage perk at this time that we are aware of that actually boosts melee damage. So if the Syntheseps rework next season and they're stepping back of some of those glaive damage nerfs does go through and it ends up being pretty effective, then expect close to melee glaives to be, you know, possibly pretty good for maybe some champ content, some mini boss bursting, maybe even boss damage. So that's why close to melee is given 3 points. It is the only glaive damage perk that really synergizes the best with glaives. So with that being said, let's move on to the actual tier list. Now, just a reminder, because some of you were asking this in the chat in the comments earlier, these tier lists, all of these special weapon tier lists, the S tier is not equal across all the weapons. These are all ranked on an individual within the ecosystem of this weapon type. So for example, an S tier glaive is not going to be equally viable as like an S tier shotgun or an S tier GL. Obviously something like an S tier like GL like Forbearance is going to be much more generally useful in endgame content than something like an S tier glaive. But I didn't think that needs to be said, but just to be clear, that is my stance on the matter when it comes to ranking these glaives. So let's get on with the actual list. There's only 7 glaives to get through here. Glaives have a very limited perk pool, so this is going to be pretty fast, but let's knock right through it. First, we have Ecliptic Distaff. Okay, hope I'm saying that right. Ecliptic Distaff. Oh, that is not the right. I just tabbed out. My bad. Okay, so first we have Ecliptic Distaff. This thing is a ritual / pursuit weapon, so it only has a 2x2 of perks, but they're pretty good. It has replenishing ages, which is great. Has a movable object, also great, and it has close to melee, and it's an adaptive. So this thing is really, really great. Definitely the best void glaive in the game. A lot of time when you're choosing a glaive to take along with you into something like a GM, you're choosing based on Surge. So, you know, this thing it's the best void glaive. It's a little bit better than the Enigma. So pretty solid, and it has a fixed roll. So I'm going to go ahead and put this thing solidly at the top of A tier. You know, if it had a little bit more perk diversity, it would definitely be a bit higher. And, you know, obviously it being a fixed roll doesn't help it too much either, but this thing is really great. Very, very solid for a ritual slash pursuit weapon. Its only problem is that it's a glaive, but you know, that aside, let's move on. We have Greasy Luck next. This thing is a rapid fire glaive, the only one of its kind from the Ghost of the Deep Dungeon. In terms of perks, it has Lead from Gold, which we discussed as being not that great. Impulse, which is again, you know, not that great. It's okay. We have Replenishing, which is really nice. That's a nice perk. We've got Immovable as well, which is right here in the same column. And we have Close to Melee and Unstoppable Force, which are both great. Close to Melee for damage and Unstoppable Force for roaming utility. So this thing has a pretty solid perk pool, pretty decent perk pool. It has what I would call the 4 major glaive perks, which are Replenishing, Immovable, Close to Melee, and Unstop. So because of that, I'm going to go ahead and put this thing at the top of A tier. The only thing holding this thing back is its archetype. Its archetype, you know, not great. And I guess if it was craftable, it would have access to enhanced perks, which would make it a little bit better as well. Okay, moving on, we have Kelgorath. Now this thing stirred up a bit of a frenzy because it was the first glaive, I believe, with Close to Melee. Now that's no longer the case. There are better archetypes with better better column 1 perks that have access to Close to Melee. So this thing is no longer what it was cut out to be back then when it first released. So I'm going to put this thing solidly in the B tier, but let's go over its perk pool and discuss it real quick before we settle it into the B tier. This thing has Impulse Amp in the wrong column. It has Immovable Object as well. It has Demo and Pugilist for kind of like melee builds. And it has Close to Melee and Unstoppable Force. So again, it has 2 good damage perks. You know, it's missing Replenishing, and it has, you know, kind of a bad, you know, the worst archetype. So this thing goes solidly in the B tier. It's got decent damage perks, but again, not the greatest thing in the world. Okay, let's move on to Lubrae's Ruin. Lubrae's Ruin, this thing is from Vow of the Disciple. It's a craftable adaptive glaive. So, you know, it's got a good archetype. But in terms of perks, it's a bit of a letdown, right? It has Grave Robber, which I believe this is one of the only 2 glaives in the game that have Grave Robber. So in terms of like, you know, if you had this thing for a roaming build where you're just spamming melees with something like Worm God or Winter's Guile or Syntheseps, this thing is pretty good for that because Grave Robber is a great perk that works with that playstyle. Otherwise, the first column, it just has Immovable, which is okay. This thing's main problem is it doesn't really have like a really solid reload perk outside of Grave Robber. So it's kind of shoehorned into just being like an Immovable or like a Grave Robber and like Unstop Glaive, which is okay. Yeah, it doesn't really have like a place right now. I think this thing belongs in the B tier. I'm going to put it at the bottom of B tier. Okay, next up we have Nezarec's Whisper. Nezarec's Whisper for a short while was the only arc glaive in the game. So if you wanted to use it in like an arc burn, not arc burn, arc surge GM, this was kind of like your only option. But you know, that has changed recently, and we'll go over that when we reach the end of this list. But unfortunately, this thing's perks are not really good. I mean, you have Lead, which is okay, Tilting, which is mid, Genesis, which is bad, Compulsive, which is bad, Impulse, which is okay, and then you have Demo, right? So the first column, not looking too great. You have a bunch of perks that are basically like, you know, what are they doing on a glaive, right? You have Frenzy, which is fine, Vorpal, which is like why, and then you have Unstop. So this thing is easily the worst overall perk pool when it comes to glaives. And glaives, just to remind you here, glaives have a pretty restricted perk pool that Bungie allows them to have. So it's pretty easy for glaives to have at least some decent perks. This thing's missing a lot of like decent perks. It's just okay. It's just okay. So I'm going to put this thing in the C tier. It's going to be the only glaive in the C tier. Just to remind you guys, if I didn't say this already, the difference between the best glaive and the worst glaive is really small. It's really small compared to the best shotgun and the worst shotgun, best GL, worst GL. You know, those are a pretty big difference. But glaives, you know, even the C tier, if there was any glaives in the D tier, which, spoiler alert, there are none. But if there was any glaives in the D tier, you could still use them, right? It's not the end of the world. It's not a big deal. Glaives are glaives. They do their job, right? The only thing that would really be specialized when it comes to glaive is Close to Melee. So, you know, besides that, it's not a big deal, but this thing does go in the C tier because of its very, very lackluster perk pool. Okay, We have the Enigma, and then we have Resurgence next, and then we'll be done with the list. So let's talk about the Enigma. This thing was the first glaive introduced in the game, craftable as introduced as part of the Witch Queen Enclave kind of storyline. This thing has Impulse, it has Grave, it has Frenzy, and it has Unstop Force. So, you know, it has some decent options. It also has Unrelenting, which is, you know, kind of quirky, I guess. But everything else, you know, it's just kind of, it's just passable. I think the Enigma, we're going to put it solidly, what do we decide to put it in? I think we're going to put it, because it's an adaptive and it has most of the core perks for roaming, I think it goes bottom of A tier. Yeah. I would say being better than the aggressive that Kelgorath is, I think we're going to put in the A tier. And Lubrae is just really limited on options that make it a good roaming tool. And then it has Grave Robber, but again, it doesn't have close to melee. So I think Enigma makes sense to put at the bottom of A tier. Okay, finally, our last glaive. You might notice the S tier is empty. And that's because our last glaive fits perfectly in the S tier. This thing was introduced with Trials very recently. And I think it flew under a lot of people's radars, but, you know, people. This thing has close to melee, it has Frenzy, it has Unstop Force. If Surrounded work, it has Surrounded. It has auto-loading. I think it's the first glaive with auto-loading. Yeah, it's the first glaive with auto-loading. It has Impulse. It has Replenishing. This thing has almost every single good perk a glaive can have. It's got excellent stats, being a Trials like Pinnacle weapon, and it's an adaptive. So this thing has literally everything you could want from a glaive. And it's great. It's great. The only thing this thing is missing is a movable object, which is not a big deal. It's not the end of the world. So we're going to put this thing solidly in the S tier by its lonesome. I think that's pretty much all I have to say about glaives. Next on our list, we're going to be doing the heavy weapons. So look forward to that. We're going to probably host a vote in chat right about now when it comes to discussing which heavy weapon we should do first. But yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed our brief discussion on glaives. I'm sure most of you have probably taken away more from the discussion of how glaives are used and how they might be used in endgame content, instead of just kind of the actual tiering itself, because this is probably not a surprise to anyone. So yeah, that's pretty much it for glaives. I hope you guys enjoyed. And again, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the comment section. And yeah, I'll see you guys when we talk about some heavy weapons next.